When did saving my daughter mean crossing the line I swore I'd never cross? The call came at 2:14 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was staring at my phone when it rang, unable to sleep after another 16-hour shift at the hospital. My daughter Chloe's name flashed on the screen and my stomach dropped before I even answered. She was supposed to be at college 300 miles away, safe in her dorm room, living the life I'd worked myself into exhaustion to provide for her. Her voice was wrong when I answered, not crying, not panicked, just flat and hollow like someone had scooped out everything that made her Chloe and left behind a shell. "Dad, something happened," she said, and those 3 words destroyed my world. I was already grabbing my keys before she finished the sentence, told her to stay where she was, to lock her door, to not talk to anyone until I got there. The drive from Portland to Eugene usually took 2 hours. I made it in 90 minutes. Chloe was sitting on the curb outside her dorm building when I arrived at 4:03 a.m. She was wearing pajama pants and an oversized sweatshirt, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking slightly back and forth. Her roommate Sierra sat beside her, with a protective arm around Chloe's shoulders. When Chloe saw my car, she stood up and walked toward me with this strange mechanical gait, like her body was moving, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. I hugged her, and she felt rigid and cold despite the sweatshirt. Sierra looked at me with tears streaming down her face. "We were at a party at the Kappa Sigma house," she said. "Chloe went upstairs to use the bathroom and didn't come back for almost 2 hours. When I finally found her, she was sitting in a bedroom by herself, just staring at the wall. She wouldn't tell me what happened, but I know something did. I called campus police, but they said without a formal complaint they couldn't do anything. Said we should come to the station in the morning to file a report if Chloe wanted to." I looked at my daughter, who still hadn't made eye contact with me. "Chloe, what happened?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't want to talk about it here. Can we just go home?" I helped her into the car, and we drove back to Portland in silence. Sierra had packed a bag for Chloe and given me her medications and her laptop. Said she'd handle things with their professors and the housing office. Said Chloe just needed to focus on herself right now. The sun was coming up when we got home. My wife Natalie was waiting in the kitchen, her face drawn with worry after I'd called her from the road. She tried to hug Chloe, but our daughter flinched away from the contact. Natalie's face crumpled, but she recovered quickly and offered to make breakfast. Chloe said she wasn't hungry and went upstairs to her old bedroom. We heard the door close and the lock click into place. Natalie and I sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee neither of us wanted while the morning light filled the room with a brightness that felt obscene. "What do you think happened?" Natalie whispered. I told her what Sierra had said about the party and the bedroom and Chloe's state when she was found. Natalie's hands started shaking so badly she had to put down her mug. We'd both worked in healthcare long enough to recognize the signs. Sexual assault, the words we didn't want to say out loud. Chloe stayed in her room all day. Natalie tried bringing her food and got sent away. I tried knocking and got silence. Around 6 p.m., Chloe finally emerged to use the bathroom. She looked worse than she had that morning. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face pale, her movements still that same mechanical quality. She saw me in the hallway and said, "I need to talk to both of you," before going back to her room. 10 minutes later, she came downstairs and sat on the couch with her knees pulled up to her chest. "His name is Ethan Prescott," Chloe said in that same flat voice. "He's a senior, pre-law, president of his fraternity. I met him at the party and he seemed nice. We were talking about classes and he offered to show me his study notes from a class I'm taking next semester. He said they were in his room upstairs. I thought other people would be up there, but when we got to the hallway it was empty. He opened a door and I walked in thinking it was his room, but it was just some random bedroom. Before I could turn around, he'd closed the door and locked it. Natalie made a sound like she'd been punched. I felt my hands clench into fists. Chloe continued in that horrible monotone. "He said we should get to know each other better first before looking at the notes. He pushed me onto the bed and I tried to get up, but he was so much stronger than me. I said no. I kept saying no, but he just laughed and said I'd come upstairs with him, so I must want it. He held me down and I couldn't move. I couldn't scream because his hand was over my mouth. It felt like it lasted forever, but probably it was maybe 10 minutes. When he was done, he just got up and straightened his clothes and told me I should clean myself up before going back downstairs. Said if I told anyone, no one would believe me because everyone saw me go upstairs with him willingly. I was on my feet before I realized I'd moved. The rage that flooded through me was so intense I couldn't see straight. Natalie was crying openly now, but I felt nothing except this cold, crystal-clear fury. Ethan Prescott, pre-law, Kappa Sigma president. I was already planning what I was going to do to him. Chloe looked at me with those dead eyes and said, "Don't, Dad. It won't help. It'll just make things worse." But all I could think about was driving back to Eugene and finding this piece of human garbage who'd violated my daughter, finding him and making him understand what real suffering felt like, making him pay for what he'd stolen from Chloe in ways the legal system never would. I'd been a paramedic before going back to school for nursing. I'd seen enough trauma to know that rapists rarely faced real consequences, that the system protected men like Ethan Prescott while destroying victims like my daughter all over again. Natalie convinced me to sit down, to breathe, to listen to what Chloe needed instead of acting on my rage. Chloe said she didn't want to report it to police because she couldn't face the questions and the exams and the disbelief. Said she just wanted to forget it happened and move on with her life. But I could see she was already broken in ways that wouldn't heal easily. The spark that had always defined my daughter was gone, replaced by this hollow shell that wore her face. We convinced Chloe to at least see a doctor. Natalie drove her to the hospital the next morning while I called in sick to work. The rape kit exam took 4 hours. When they came home, Chloe went straight to her room without speaking. Natalie told me the doctor had documented injuries consistent with forcible assault. They'd collected evidence and given Chloe medications for STI prevention and emergency contraception. The doctor had encouraged her to file a police report, but Chloe had refused. That night, I did something I'd never done before and started researching Ethan Prescott. Found his social media profiles full of pictures of him at parties and sporting events, living his best life while my daughter was traumatized and hiding in her childhood bedroom. Found articles about him in the university newspaper, student government, dean's list, volunteer work, the perfect image of a successful college student. Found his parents' names and their address in Lake Oswego, one of Portland's wealthiest suburbs. His father was a prominent attorney. His mother sat on multiple nonprofit boards. The Prescott family was Portland society. I found photos of Ethan with his arm around different girls at various parties, young women who looked happy in the pictures, but I wondered how many of them had their own stories, how many had gone upstairs with him thinking they were safe, how many had been too afraid or too broken to speak up afterward. The pattern was probably there if anyone bothered to look, but no one looked at boys like Ethan Prescott with suspicion. They looked at them with pride. Chloe started therapy 3 days later with a counselor who specialized in sexual assault. She went to her appointments but wouldn't talk about what happened in the sessions, just said the therapist was nice and that she was working through things, but at home she was a ghost, slept most of the day, barely ate, flinched when anyone touched her, started having nightmares that woke up the whole house with her screaming. 2 weeks after the assault, Sierra called me, said she needed to tell me something but didn't want Chloe to know she'd called. She'd been at another party the night before and overheard Ethan Prescott bragging to his friends about that freshman who came upstairs with him. Heard him say Chloe had been easy and that he'd known she wanted it, despite her protests. Heard him and his friends laughing about it like it was a joke. Sierra was crying when she told me this. Said she'd wanted to confront him but was too scared. Said Kappa Sigma basically ran the campus social scene and going against them meant social suicide. The rage that I'd been suppressing erupted again. This monster had raped my daughter, and now he was bragging about it, making it into a story to tell his friends, reducing Chloe's trauma to entertainment. And he was getting away with it because he had the right last name and the right connections and the right image. The injustice of it made me physically ill. I thanked Sierra for calling and hung up before she could hear the violence in my voice. I started following Ethan Prescott's social media obsessively, tracking his movements and schedule. He posted constantly about his life, classes and parties and fraternity events and study sessions. He tagged his location in every post like he had nothing to hide, like he was untouchable. I learned his routines and patterns, where he ate breakfast, where he studied, which bars he went to on weekend nights, what time he left the fraternity house for his morning runs. Natalie caught me one night at 3 a.m. sitting in my home office with pages of printed information about Ethan Prescott spread across my desk. She asked what I was doing and I lied and said I was just trying to understand who he was. She looked at me with this expression of fear and pity and said, "Nathan, you can't do whatever you're thinking about doing. Chloe needs you here, not in prison." I told her I wasn't thinking about doing anything. We both knew it was a lie. 3 weeks after the assault, Chloe told us she wanted to go back to school, said hiding at home was making her feel worse. Her therapist agreed it might be good for her to reclaim her normal life. We enrolled her in online classes for the rest of the semester so she wouldn't have to physically go back to campus yet. She started attending them from her bedroom, slowly emerging from her shell, but she was still a shadow of who she'd been, still jumped at sudden noises, still had nightmares, still carried this weight that showed in every movement. I went back to work at the hospital but couldn't focus, made mistakes that could have hurt patients, got pulled aside by my supervisor who said I needed to take some time off or she'd have to write me up. I took a leave of absence using FMLA, told Natalie and Chloe it was so I could be home to support Chloe's recovery. That was partially true, but mostly I needed time to figure out what I was going to do about Ethan Prescott. The university's Title IX office finally contacted Chloe 6 weeks after the assault. Sierra had apparently filed a third-party report without telling anyone. The Title IX coordinator left voicemails asking Chloe to come in for an interview. Chloe called them back and said she didn't want to participate in any investigation. The coordinator explained that they could still investigate based on the third-party report. Chloe said she wouldn't cooperate and asked them to close the case. They agreed. That easily. The system designed to protect students gave up without a fight. I called the Title IX office myself and asked to speak with the coordinator. Her name was Margaret Voss, and she sounded exhausted. I explained I was Chloe's father and wanted to know what could be done even without Chloe's cooperation. Margaret said without a formal complaint from the victim, their hands were tied. University policy required the victim to participate in any investigation. I asked what happened to other reports against Ethan Prescott. She went silent for a long moment before saying she couldn't discuss other students. The silence told me everything. There were other reports. He'd done this before. I pushed harder, asked if there was any way to investigate without putting Chloe through more trauma. Margaret said the only option would be if another victim came forward and agreed to participate. But she said that was unlikely because most victims chose not to report specifically to avoid the re-traumatization of the process. She apologized for not being able to do more, said the system was broken, but she was bound by its rules. I heard the genuine regret in her voice, but it didn't matter. Ethan Prescott was going to continue attending classes and parties and hurting other young women because the system protected him. That night, I made a decision. The system had failed my daughter, failed all the other victims who were too afraid to come forward. Someone needed to hold Ethan Prescott accountable. Someone needed to make him face consequences that actually mattered. I knew what I was planning was illegal, knew it was dangerous, knew it could destroy my life and my family, but watching Chloe suffer every day while her rapist lived without consequences was destroying me anyway. I started planning with the same methodical approach I'd once used in emergency medicine. Gathered intelligence, identified opportunities, assessed risks. Ethan Prescott ran every morning at 6 a.m. through Hendricks Park, a wooded area near campus. He always ran alone, always took the same route, always wore earbuds so he couldn't hear people approaching. He was predictable, arrogant, believed he was untouchable. That arrogance would be his downfall. I drove to Eugene on a Friday afternoon and checked into a motel under a fake name, paying cash. Spent the evening driving around the campus area and the park, familiarizing myself with routes and timing. Bought supplies from different stores using cash, a baseball bat from a sporting goods store in a different town, dark clothing from a thrift shop, a burner phone, everything that couldn't be traced back to me. Saturday morning, I woke up at 4:30 a.m. and drove to Hendricks Park, parked in a residential area 3 blocks away where my car wouldn't be near any security cameras, walked to the park in the pre-dawn darkness, found a spot off the main path where I could wait hidden in the trees, pulled on gloves, gripped the bat, and waited. Ethan Prescott came jogging past at 6:08 a.m., tall and fit and confident, earbuds in, eyes forward, completely unaware. I stepped out behind him and swung the bat into the back of his knee. He went down hard with a scream. Before he could process what was happening, I hit him again in the ribs. Then again. The rage that had been building for 2 months poured out through the bat. This was for Chloe, for every nightmare she'd had, for every moment of her life he'd stolen. Ethan tried to crawl away, but I dragged him deeper into the trees where no one would see from the path. He was begging now, asking what he'd done, saying he was sorry for whatever it was. I pulled off his earbuds and made him look at me. "Chloe Abbott," I said, "the girl you raped at your fraternity house 2 months ago. Do you even remember her name, or was she just another freshman to you?" Recognition and fear flooded his face. He started babbling excuses, said it wasn't rape, said she'd come upstairs with him willingly, said she'd wanted it, The same excuses every rapist used. I hit him again, harder, felt his ribs crack under the bat. He screamed louder, and I knew I needed to finish this and get out before someone heard. I leaned down close to his face. "You're going to leave Eugene, drop out of school and go away. Because if I ever hear you've hurt another woman, if I ever see you post another smug photo on social media, if I ever learn that you're still walking around like you deserve to live a normal life, I will come back and I will kill you. Do you understand me?" He nodded frantically, blood running from his nose and mouth. "Say you understand." His voice was barely a whisper. "I understand." I left him there crying and broken and walked back to my car, drove back to Portland, stopped at a rest area and disposed of the bat and clothing in different dumpsters, got home before Natalie and Chloe woke up, took a long shower and tried to wash away what I'd done, but I didn't feel guilty. I felt relieved, like I'd finally done something meaningful to protect my daughter. The news hit that afternoon. University student assaulted in Hendricks Park. Serious injuries but expected to survive. Police looking for suspects, but no descriptions yet. Ethan Prescott's name wasn't released initially, but Sierra texted Chloe saying she'd heard through friends it was him. Chloe came downstairs and asked if I'd seen the news. I said I had and asked how she felt about it. She looked at me for a long moment before saying, "I feel like maybe there is justice in the world after all." The investigation progressed slowly. Police interviewed fraternity members who said Ethan had enemies, girls he'd hooked up with who might be angry, but no specific suspects emerged. The lack of, security cameras in the park and the early morning timing meant no witnesses. I'd been careful, left no evidence. The attack could have been random, could have been targeted, could have been anything. Ethan withdrew from the university a week later. His family released a statement saying he needed to focus on his recovery and would be finishing his degree elsewhere. The fraternity held a fundraiser for his medical bills. His parents hired private security, but he was gone from campus, gone from Eugene, and that's what mattered. Chloe started improving after Ethan left. The nightmares became less frequent. She started eating normally again, began laughing at stupid videos on her phone. The spark wasn't fully back, but glimpses of it appeared. Her therapist noted the progress and attributed it to time and healing and Chloe's resilience. But I wondered if knowing her rapist had faced some kind of consequences had helped more than any therapy session could. 3 months after the attack, Sierra called again. Said another girl from campus had reached out to her after hearing about Ethan's assault. The girl's name was Brianna, and she'd been raped by Ethan freshman year. Never reported it because she was too afraid. But when she heard he'd been attacked, she felt brave enough to tell her story. Sierra said there were more, at least 4 other women she knew of personally, all raped by Ethan Prescott, all too scared to come forward. I met Brianna at a coffee shop in Portland. She was 20 now, a junior, with dark circles under her eyes and this haunted look I recognized from Chloe. She told me her story, how Ethan had targeted her at a party, how he'd isolated her, how he'd raped her in his room while his fraternity brothers ignored her cries for help, how she'd tried to report it to campus police and been discouraged by their questions and implications, how she'd eventually dropped out for a semester because she couldn't function. Brianna said the other victims were willing to talk too if it could help. I asked what she wanted. She said she wanted Ethan Prescott to pay for what he'd done, wanted him to face real consequences, wanted to prevent him from hurting anyone else. I told her I might be able to help, but it would mean going outside the system that had failed them all. She looked at me with those haunted eyes and said, "Whatever it takes." I connected with the other victims over the next 2 weeks. Megan, Jasmine, Aaliyah, all young women whose lives had been derailed by Ethan Prescott, all carrying trauma that would never fully heal, all betrayed by a system that valued a man's reputation over women's safety. They each told me their stories in quiet coffee shops and empty parks, their voices shaking but determined. They'd been silent for so long, but Ethan's attack had broken something loose. We decided to build a case outside the legal system, document everything and release it publicly where it couldn't be buried, create accountability through exposure. I helped them write detailed accounts of their assaults with dates and locations and witnesses. We gathered text messages and social media posts that established patterns, found other students who'd witnessed Ethan's predatory behavior, built an undeniable timeline of serial assault. Natalie discovered what I was doing when she found the folder on my computer. She read through the statements from Chloe's rapist's other victims and cried for an hour. Then she looked at me and said, "You attacked him, didn't you? That assault in the park, that was you." I didn't deny it, couldn't lie to her anymore. She was quiet for a long time before asking if I was planning to do it again. I said no. Said this time we were going to destroy him a different way. We worked with the victims to prepare their statements for public release. They decided to publish everything on a website and social media simultaneously, tagging news outlets and advocacy organizations. Going public with multiple coordinated accusations from different victims would be harder to dismiss than individual reports lost in bureaucratic systems. The solidarity would protect them in ways reporting alone never could. The website went live on a Monday morning. 5 detailed accounts of sexual assault by Ethan Prescott with supporting evidence and witnesses. Within hours, it had thousands of views. By afternoon, local news outlets were covering the story. By evening, it was trending nationally. The university issued a statement saying they took all allegations seriously and were reviewing the matter. Kappa Sigma suspended Ethan's membership pending investigation. Ethan's father held a press conference calling the accusations a coordinated attack on his son. Said anonymous accusers couldn't be trusted. Said his son was a victim twice, first of false allegations and then of a violent assault. His lawyers threatened to sue everyone involved for defamation, but the court of public opinion had already convicted Ethan. Comment sections filled with stories from other survivors. The pattern was undeniable. The Eugene Police Department announced they were reopening investigations into the sexual assault allegations based on new evidence. The university's Title IX office finally launched a formal investigation. Margaret Voss called to apologize for not doing more initially. Said the public pressure had forced the administration to act. Better late than never, but I couldn't forget how easily they'd dismissed everything before it became a PR crisis. Ethan Prescott's life unraveled in spectacular fashion. His transfer to another university was denied after the new school saw the allegations. His father's law firm asked him to step down from leadership positions to avoid association. His mother resigned from her nonprofit boards. The family that had protected and enabled him couldn't withstand the scrutiny. They sold their Lake Oswego house and moved to California. Criminal charges were filed 3 months after the website launched. Not for the original assaults, which were beyond statute of limitations or lacked sufficient evidence, but for witness tampering and obstruction. Police discovered Ethan had paid one of his fraternity brothers to intimidate Brianna after her initial report. That charge stuck. He pled guilty and received 3 years in prison. It wasn't enough, would never be enough for what he'd done, but it was more than most rapists ever faced. The victims found some measure of closure in knowing their voices had finally been heard, that their courage in coming forward had prevented future assaults, that the system had been forced to acknowledge its failures. Chloe graduated from college 2 years later. She'd transferred to Portland State and finished her degree in psychology, said she wanted to work with trauma survivors, use her experience to help others heal. At her graduation, I watched her walk across that stage and felt overwhelming pride mixed with lingering rage at what she'd endured. She was thriving despite Ethan Prescott, because of her own strength and resilience. The investigation into Ethan's assault in the park remained unsolved. Police eventually classified it as a cold case. They'd interviewed hundreds of people but never found their suspect. Never connected it to me because I'd been careful, because I'd planned properly, because I'd left no trace. Sometimes I wondered if the detective in charge suspected but chose not to look too hard, if he'd seen enough victims failed by the system to understand why someone might take justice into their own hands. Natalie and I never discussed that morning in Hendricks Park again. She knew what I'd done and I knew she knew, but we'd made an unspoken agreement to protect our family by not acknowledging it out loud. Some truths were too dangerous to voice even in private. We focused instead on rebuilding our lives and supporting Chloe's healing. I went back to work at the hospital after my leave ended, found new purpose in treating victims of violence, advocated more forcefully for vulnerable patients, pushed back against doctors and administrators who dismissed trauma, used my position to create change in the small ways available to me. But I never forgot what I'd learned about the limits of systems and the necessity of sometimes operating outside them. Years passed, and Chloe built a life defined by more than what Ethan Prescott had done to her. She got engaged to someone who understood her history and loved her anyway, started a nonprofit helping college assault victims navigate reporting processes, testified before the state legislature about needed reforms to Title IX procedures, transformed her trauma into advocacy that helped hundreds of other survivors. I watched my daughter become this fierce advocate and wondered what would have happened if I hadn't crossed that line in Hendricks Park. Would Ethan have continued assaulting women unopposed? Would Chloe have found healing without seeing some kind of justice? Would the other victims have found courage to speak up if they hadn't seen someone willing to act when the system wouldn't? The counterfactuals haunted me, but offered no answers. The moral weight of what I'd done never fully lifted. I'd committed a violent felony against another human being, violated my oath to do no harm, risked my freedom and my family's future, become the kind of person I'd never imagined being, but I'd also protected my daughter in the only way that seemed available when every official channel had failed. The justice system wasn't designed to handle serial predators like Ethan Prescott, who knew how to exploit its weaknesses. I thought about that morning in the park often, the feel of the bat connecting with flesh and bone, the sound of Ethan's screams, the cold calculation with which I'd planned and executed the attack. The person capable of that violence still lived inside me, waiting. I'd discovered I could cross lines I'd thought were uncrossable if the stakes were high enough, if my child's life and future were threatened. That knowledge was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Natalie sometimes looked at me with this expression that was equal parts love and wariness. She'd spent our marriage believing she knew who I was, and then learned I was capable of things she'd never imagined. The attack had changed me fundamentally, made me harder, more willing to consider extreme solutions, less trusting of authority and systems. She mourned the idealistic man she'd married while accepting the pragmatic one circumstances had created. Chloe thrived, that's what mattered most. She'd survived sexual assault and institutional betrayal and emerged stronger, found her voice and used it to create change, built a life of meaning and purpose. Sometimes she looked at me with knowing eyes, and I wondered how much she'd figured out, whether she'd connected the timing of Ethan's attack with my sudden leave from work, whether she'd chosen not to ask questions she didn't want answers to. We never discussed it. Some conversations were better left in silence. The other victims moved forward with their lives too. Brianna became a victims' rights attorney. Megan started a campus safety nonprofit. Jasmine and Aliyah graduated and built careers. They all carried scars but refused to let those scars define them. Their courage in speaking up had created ripples. The university implemented new policies. The fraternity system faced increased scrutiny. Other survivors felt empowered to report. Change came slowly, but it came. Ethan Prescott served 27 months before being released on parole. His father's connections had secured him minimum security and early release despite the severity of his crimes. He moved to California and lived under strict parole conditions, registered as a sex offender, struggled to find employment. His life would never return to the privileged comfort he'd known. The consequences weren't proportional to the harm he'd caused, but they were permanent. I tracked his movements through parole records and social media for years, made sure he was staying away from potential victims, made sure he wasn't rebuilding the predatory patterns. The vigilance was exhausting, but necessary. I'd stopped him once through violence and again through exposure. I'd do it again if needed. Some people couldn't be reformed, only contained. My career eventually shifted toward emergency medicine policy work, advocating for better trauma protocols, training healthcare workers to recognize and respond to assault, pushing for reforms that protected victims while holding perpetrators accountable. The work felt like penance and purpose combined, using what I'd learned through Chloe's assault to create systemic change. Chloe got married on a sunny afternoon in June. Natalie and I walked her down the aisle together, and I thought about all the moments Ethan Prescott had almost stolen from us. This wedding, future grandchildren, the simple joy of watching our daughter build a life. He'd tried to break her and failed. She was whole in ways that mattered more than the pieces he'd damaged. At the reception, Chloe pulled me aside. We stood in the garden while music drifted from the tent. She looked at me with clear eyes and said, "I know what you did, Dad. I figured it out a long time ago. I'm not asking you to confirm it. I just want you to know that I understand why, and I forgive you for carrying that weight alone." My throat closed. I couldn't speak. She hugged me and whispered, "Thank you for loving me enough to become someone you hated." We stood there in the garden while the party continued around us, father and daughter bound by trauma and secrets, and a love that had driven me to cross lines I'd sworn I'd never cross. The person I'd been before that phone call at 2:14 a.m. was gone forever. In his place was someone harder, more dangerous, less certain about the bright lines between right and wrong, but also someone who'd learned that protecting family sometimes required becoming the monster temporarily, so they could remain human. Chloe went back to the reception, and I stood alone watching her dance with her new husband. Natalie found me and took my hand. We didn't speak. The weight of what we'd survived together lived in the silence between us. The violence, the secrets, the moral compromises, the knowledge that we'd do it all again if circumstances demanded. I never regretted crossing that line in Hendricks Park, never lost sleep over the violence I'd inflicted on Ethan Prescott. He was alive and could heal from broken ribs and shattered knees. The women he'd assaulted would carry their trauma forever. The scales weren't balanced, but they'd tipped slightly toward justice. Sometimes that was the best you could hope for. Years continued passing, and life normalized in ways that felt miraculous after the chaos of that period. Grandchildren came. Chloe's nonprofit expanded nationally. The legislative reforms she'd championed became law. Ethan Prescott faded into obscurity as just another failed predator whose victims had refused to stay silent. The story had no perfect ending, just survival and rebuilding and the quiet satisfaction of knowing we'd fought back when the system wouldn't. The question of whether I'd been right to attack Ethan Prescott would haunt me until I died. The moral certainty I'd felt in that moment had long since faded into complexity and doubt. Violence begat violence. Vigilante justice undermined the rule of law. Taking matters into my own hands had made me a criminal, regardless of whether the cause was just. These truths coexisted uncomfortably with the reality that my actions had protected future victims and given Chloe space to heal. I'd crossed a line I swore I'd never cross, became someone I'd never imagined being, committed acts I couldn't undo or fully justify. The weight of those choices lived in my bones, but I'd also saved my daughter in the ways available to me when all legitimate avenues had failed, proved that love could drive ordinary people to extraordinary acts, discovered that the bright lines of morality blurred when confronted with a child's suffering and a system's indifference. Chloe thrived because she was resilient and brave and refused to let trauma define her. My actions were just one factor among many in her recovery, but they'd mattered. The consequences Ethan faced because of that morning in Hendricks Park had given her permission to begin healing. The knowledge that someone had fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself had helped restore her faith in protection and justice. Looking back from the safety of years, I understood the full cost of what I'd done. The risk to my family if I'd been caught, the corruption of my own values, the impossible position I'd put Natalie in, the burden of secrets Chloe carried. The line I'd crossed couldn't be uncrossed. The person I'd become couldn't return to innocence. But watching my daughter dance at her wedding, seeing her smile without shadows, knowing she'd built a life of meaning despite everything, I accepted the cost as necessary. Saving my daughter had meant crossing the line I swore I'd never cross, becoming someone I'd promised myself I'd never become, carrying weight I'd never wanted to bear. But she was alive and thriving, and that made every compromise worthwhile. Some lines exist to be crossed when protecting those you love. Some promises to yourself must break when confronted with a child's pain. Some weights must be carried alone, so others can walk free. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.